I remember temperature first, 37.2 degrees Celsius, normal human baseline. I remember this because I checked it obsessively during my first week aboard the Tyrannos Eternal. The med servitor would extend its sensor array, and I would watch the readout flicker and settle. 37.2. Proof I was still baseline human, despite the third eye that had opened in my forehead 3 years prior. My name was Carthus then. Carthus Navarre, fourth son of House Navarre, ranked 17th among the Navigator houses in terms of warrant antiquity. These details mattered to my father. He spoke them at every formal gathering, his voice carrying across halls that smelled of incense and old metal. I was 12 when the Navis Nobilite claimed me, 14 when my training completed, 16 when I received my first assignment aboard a system monitor craft, 23 when I transferred to the Tyrannos Eternal, a Luna-class cruiser assigned to Battlefleet Pacificus. I had seen the warp 47 times by then. Brief transits, never more than 10 days subjective time. The training cadre called me competent, not gifted, not touched by special grace, competent. I could plot a course, hold it steady, bring a ship through without incident. In an Imperium that lost 3% of all warp-capable vessels to mistranslation, catastrophic emergence, or simple disappearance, competent was valuable. The Tyrannos Eternal smelled like every Imperial vessel. Recycled air with undertones of machine oil, incense residue from daily devotionals, the metallic tang that never quite left spaces where thousands of humans lived compressed together. My chamber was 3 meters by 4, a navigator's privilege. Most crew shared dormitories with 60 others. I had a door that sealed, a cot, a desk bolted to the deck plating, a small shrine to the Emperor. Everyone had those, monitored by the shipboard ecclesiarchy ratings, who noted attendance and devotion in their endless ledgers. I remember the first time I met Nicodemus. This memory has texture. The others blur now, files accessed so many times the data has degraded. But this one remains sharp. He entered my chamber without announcing. The door simply opened and he stood there, wearing the dark green uniform of the ship's Executive Officer Corps, his cap removed, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone 17 hours into a 20-hour shift. I was reviewing star charts, physical ones, parchment and ink, certified by the Adeptus Mechanicus with their seals of authenticity stamped in red wax along the margins. Navigator Carthus, he said. Not a question. Yes. Commander Nicodemus Valence, Executive Officer, 2nd Watch Rotation. The captain requires your assessment of the tertiary approach for the fleet muster. I unrolled the relevant chart. Tertiary approach. A stable warp corridor connecting the hydrophore system to the tertiary way station, distance of approximately 4 light-years real space, subjective transit time 7 to 9 days, depending on current conditions. The corridor had maintained stability for 6,000 years according to the certification date on the chart. The Mechanicus renewal seal was dated 32 years ago, well within acceptable parameters. The approach is stable, I told him. Standard transit protocols apply. I see no complications. He stepped closer to examine the chart. I noticed his hands first, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of damage that comes from repeated impact. Void-born crew often had those scars. Growing up in confined spaces, learning to fight in corridors where weapons fire meant hull breaches, and everyone died. You trust the charts, he said. They're certified. How old is the survey data? I checked the marginalia. Initial survey 9,200 years ago. Renewed surveys at 1,000-year intervals. Last renewal 32 years ago. 32 years. He said it flatly, without emphasis, just stating the fact. The corridor is categorized as stable prime classification. Renewal surveys are required every 5 decades. This chart is current. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not at my forehead where the third eye rested beneath its protective headband. At my face, My baseline human face that hadn't yet begun the transformations that marked elder navigators. How old are you, navigators? 23 standard years. How many fleet actions have you guided? This will be my first. He nodded slowly, not disapproving, just filing data. 40 ships, 17,000 personnel. Agricultural tithes for 6 sectors depend on securing the tertiary granaries before the harvest ships arrive from the outer system agri-worlds. I understand the strategic importance. Do you? Again, not a question. He rolled the chart carefully, his scarred hands precise despite their damage. The tertiary approach, Navigator. I've transited it 17 times in my 20 years of service. It's stable until it isn't. The warp doesn't honor our charts. The Mechanicus certifications are produced by tech priests who haven't seen the warp, who measure stability in their temples and workshops and proclaim safety from places that have never felt a Gellerfield flicker. He handed me the chart. I'm not questioning your competence. I'm ensuring you understand what 40 ships means. I understand. Good. He turned toward the door, then paused. You'll attend the navigation briefing at 1800 hours. The captain will want your verbal confirmation for the fleet logs. I'll be there. He left. The door sealed. I sat with the chart unrolled across my desk, staring at the red certification seals, the careful calligraphy that marked distances and corridor boundaries. The annotations in High Gothic proclaiming the Emperor's protection over all who traversed these approved routes. 37.2 degrees. I checked my temperature again. Still baseline. Still human. Still certain the charts were correct. The navigation briefing occurred in the senior officer's stratagium, a vaulted chamber near the bridge where hololithic displays projected fleet positions and warp route calculations. 40 ship captains attended via Pictolink, their faces arrayed across monitoring screens. Captain Hadrian presided from his command throne, a massive seat incorporating targeting controls, communication arrays, and life support interfaces. He was 73 years old, void-born third-generation command lineage. Navigator Carthus. His voice resonated through the chamber's Vox amplification. Confirm your assessment. I stood before the central hololithic display showing the tertiary approach corridor. 40 ship icons clustered in formation around the Tyrannos Eternal. The tertiary approach remains stable, Captain. Mechanicus certification current to within acceptable parameters. Recommended transit formation is standard convoy configuration. Geller fields overlapping for mutual reinforcement. Estimated subjective transit time, 7.3 days accounting for fleet mass and coordination requirements. Complications? None indicated by current survey data. You've reviewed the historical logs. I had. 17 successful transits in the past decade alone. No reported incidents. No vessel losses. The corridor's stability record was exceptional even by stable prime standards. Yes, Captain. The tertiary approach has maintained consistent stability for over 6 millennia. I assess minimal risk for this transit. Across the monitoring screens, 40 captains registered their acceptance. Some looked satisfied. Some looked simply resigned. Warp transit always carried risk, regardless of navigator assessments and Mechanicus certifications. You entered the Empyrean and trusted that your Geller field would hold. Your navigator would see true, and the things that lived between rail space and unreality would not notice your passage. Nicodemus stood to the captain's left, his position as executive officer granting him proximity to command authority. He watched me without expression, his scarred hands clasped behind his back. Fleet will assemble for translation in 6 hours, Captain Hadrian declared. All vessels confirm navigation data transmission and Geller field integrity before final muster. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects, we echoed. The ritual response, spoken 50,000 times daily across every Imperial vessel. I meant it then, believed it. The briefing concluded. Captains' picked feeds terminated. I remained before the hololithic display, studying the 40 ship icons, calculating mass ratios and formation spacing, reviewing my planned course one final time. "You're certain?" Nicodemus had approached without sound, a skill I would later learn he'd developed during boarding actions, where noise meant detection and detection meant death. "The charts are certified." That's not what I asked. I looked at him, at his exhaustion, his scars, his 20 years of service written across his face in fine lines and gray threading his temples. "I'm certain," I said. "Then we'll trust you." He said it simply. Not reassurance, statement of fact. 40 ships would trust my navigation. 17,000 personnel would trust my third eye to see them through the warp's madness. I returned to my chamber. 6 hours until translation. I spent them in meditation, standard Navigator discipline, preparing my consciousness for the strain of guiding so many vessels simultaneously. The third eye beneath my headband pulsed with anticipation. It always did before warp translation, responding to the proximity of the Immaterium even through real space's barrier. 37.2 degrees. I checked one final time before proceeding to my navigation blister. The temperature reading felt important somehow, proof of something I couldn't articulate. I archived it carefully. The navigation blister extended from the Tyrannos Eternal's hull like a tumor of armored glass and sanctified metal. My throne sat at its center, a command seat incorporating neural interface ports, restraint systems, and psi-focus amplifiers that would channel my third eye's perception through the ship's systems. During warp transit, I would become the vessel's sight. My consciousness extended through 40 linked ships, holding them all within the stable corridor I had charted. The preparation rituals took 40 minutes. Tech priests anointed the interface ports with sacred oils while chanting litanies of connection. I removed my headband, exposing the third eye that dominated my forehead, leadless, always open, the iris a shade of gold that no baseline human eye could produce. An ecclesiarchy priest delivered benedictions, his words washing over me without penetration. I focused on the technical requirements: neuro-interface calibration, psi-focus amplitude settings, fleet coordination protocols. "All vessels report translation readiness," the bridge vox crackled. "Navigator, you may begin when prepared." Restraints engaged across my chest, arms, legs, necessary because warp navigation sometimes produced convulsions as the navigator's consciousness struggled to process the Immaterium's impossible geometries. The neural interface ports clicked home against the sockets implanted at the base of my skull during my 14th year. Cold metal penetrating flesh. Direct connection to ship systems. "Beginning translation sequence," I transmitted. My voice carried simultaneously to all 40 vessels, 40 captains hearing my confirmation, 40 Geller field generators preparing to activate, 40 crews securing for transit. I opened my third eye fully. The universe collapsed into madness and meaning simultaneously. The warp is not darkness. Darkness implies absence of light, simple void, measurable emptiness. The warp is presence, too much presence. Every thought that ever existed, every emotion that ever burned through human consciousness, compressed into a space that has no space, time that has no sequence, reality that has no consistent laws, colors that have no names, sounds that predate sound, entities that laugh with voices like solar flares devouring planets. But through the madness, roots existed. Corridors of relative stability where the Astronomican's light penetrated, where reality remembered itself enough to permit passage. Navigators saw these roots. Our third eyes perceived what baseline humans could not, the difference between swimming through acid and swimming through slightly less corrosive acid. Both would kill you, one might kill you slower. I found the tertiary approach immediately. The charts had marked it precisely. A broad corridor of golden stability cutting through the warp's chromatic insanity. 6,000 years of successful transits had worn the route smooth, countless ships passing through, their Geller fields leaving traces like water wearing stone. The Astronomican's light blazed at the corridor's far end, that eternal psychic beacon maintained by 10,000 dying psychers daily, showing the way to terror, to safety, to the Imperium's heart. I guided the fleet forward. 40 ships moving in formation, their Geller fields overlapping, creating a bubble of real space physics that crawled through unreality like a beetle crossing the slaughterhouse floor. The warp pressed against the fields, testing, probing, searching for weaknesses. Things moved in my peripheral vision, never looking directly at them. That way lay madness or possession or both. The corridor held stable. Day 1 passed. Subjective time only. The warp cared nothing for clocks. But human consciousness needed rhythm, needed the illusion of sequence, so we measured in shifts and days and pretended time still functioned. Day 2. The corridor remained stable. Fleet formation holding. I perceived each vessel as a bright point of real space physics, connected to my consciousness through the neural interface, through my third eye's impossible sight. 17,000 personnel reduced to 40 points of light. I held like a child holding candles in a hurricane. Day 3. I began to notice something wrong. Not obviously wrong, not catastrophic, just inconsistent. The corridor's boundaries seemed narrower than the charts indicated, not dangerously narrow, just different, as though the survey data had measured different dimensions than what I currently perceived. I checked my calculations, rechecked the charts transmitted to my throne's data slate. The measurements matched. The corridor was supposed to be 200,000 kilometers wide at this point. I estimated it at perhaps 160,000. Still navigable, still safe. Just different. Day 4. The discrepancy increased. The corridor continued narrowing, its boundaries contracting like a throat swallowing. Still stable, still passable, but my 3 years of training included extensive study of warp route dynamics. Stable corridors didn't constrict like this. They maintained consistent dimensions, varying by perhaps 5 to 10% across their length. This was 20% narrower now, and we'd only covered half the transit distance. I considered reporting the discrepancy, decided against it. The corridor remained stable, fleet formation undisturbed. Reporting inconsistencies between perception and certified charts might trigger protocols requiring translation back to real space, full survey analysis, delays that would cascade across the entire campaign timeline. Agricultural tithes delayed, sectors going hungry, potential famine responses, civil unrest, Imperial Guard deployments to maintain order, all because the corridor measured slightly narrower than charts indicated. I held course. Day 5. The corridor contracted further, now perhaps 100,000 kilometers wide. The warp pressed closer against our Geller fields, hungry things circling near enough that I could feel their attention like pressure against my skull. The Astronomican's light remained clear at the corridor's terminus, promising safe emergence. Just keep following, trust the light. My third eye burned with strain. Holding 40 ships required constant attention, constant correction, tiny adjustments as each vessel drifted microscopically within the formation. The neural interface transmitted status updates. Fleet cohesion 90 to 3%. Geller field integrity holding across all vessels. Estimated time to emergence point 2.1 days. 2 more days. I could hold 2 more days. Day 6. The corridor collapsed, not violently, not catastrophically, just ceased existing. One moment I navigated a narrow but stable route. The next moment the boundaries dissolved, the golden stability fragmenting into chromatic chaos, the warp rushing in like atmosphere into a hull breach, and I lost them. All 40 ships. The neural interface screamed feedback as connections severed. 40 points of light scattering across impossible distances, some flung forward, some backward, some perpendicular to directions that had no meaning in the Immaterium's madness. I reached for them, my consciousness extending desperately, trying to hold the formation together, but the warp doesn't permit holding. It permits only drowning or swimming, and I had just lost the corridor that made swimming possible. The Tyrannos Eternal tumbled through chaos. I forced it toward the Astronomicon, following the only constant that existed, dragging the cruiser through unreality by will and training, and the third eye that burned like fire in my skull. Behind me, around me, scattered across the warp's impossibility, 39 other vessels attempted the same desperate navigation, their navigators screaming across Vox channels, trying to coordinate, trying to re-establish formation in a space that had no formation, no stability, no mercy. I don't know how long we struggled. Time stopped meaning anything. The warp allows minutes to become months, years to compress into heartbeats. I held the Astronomicon in my third eye's focus and dragged my ship toward it. Moment by moment, while the universe screamed and things that should not exist tried to convince me that reality itself was just a persistent delusion I could choose to abandon. Eventually, hours later, days later, centuries later, the Tyrannos Eternal broke through into real space. Emergency translation. Uncontrolled emergence. The kind of entry that killed navigators when their consciousness couldn't handle the abrupt transition from warp to reality. I felt my third eye slam shut, neural interface disconnecting with feedback that tasted like copper and smelled like burning insulation, restraints releasing as my body convulsed against the throne. A med servitor reached me first, biological hands grafted to mechanical systems, carrying injectors of anticonvulsant compounds, sedatives, neural stabilizers. I felt needles penetrate my neck, felt chemicals flooding my bloodstream, felt consciousness fragmenting into medical protocols and automated responses. Status, I managed to say. The word felt like glass in my throat. Stand by for assessment. Nicodemus's voice. He'd reached the navigation blister, his uniform scorched, his face carrying blood from a laceration across his forehead. We've emerged. Position unknown. Scanning for fleet elements. I tried to sit up. Failed. The convulsions hadn't stopped, my muscles firing randomly as my nervous system attempted to reintegrate after the emergency translation. Other ships? 7 confirmed. His voice carried something I would later identify as horror. 7 out of 40. 7, the number didn't process correctly. 40 ships entered the tertiary approach. 7 emerged, 33 vessels lost, approximately 14,000 personnel. Gone. Scattered through the warp or consumed by it, or translated into real space locations we might never determine. Search patterns, I said. My voice sounded distant, processed, as though spoken by someone else using my throat as Vox speaker. Coordinate with other emerged vessels. Establish grid search. They might have translated nearby, scattered emergence. We can recover them. Navigator. Nicodemus knelt beside my throne, put his scarred hand on my shoulder, waited until my eyes focused on his face. We've been conducting search patterns for 6 hours real time. No additional contacts. 7 ships. That's all we found. 6 hours. I'd been unconscious through initial emergence, through first assessments, through the desperate scanning that revealed how thoroughly the fleet had scattered. The corridor collapsed, I told him. Needed him to understand. The charts indicated stable passage, 6,000 years of successful transits. The Mechanicus certification was current. The corridor was supposed to be there. I know. I didn't make a mistake. My voice cracked. Not from emotion. From physical damage. The emergency translation had hemorrhaged blood vessels in my throat. I followed the charts exactly. I know, he repeated. Rest now. We'll need your assessment for the fleet inquiry. The words registered distantly. When Imperial vessels disappeared, investigations followed. Formal proceedings examining every decision, every calculation, determining fault, assigning responsibility. 33 ships lost, 14,000 dead. Someone would answer for this. The med servitor administered another injection. Darkness came swiftly, chemical and complete. My last thought before unconsciousness. 37.2 degrees. I wondered what my temperature was now. Wondered if I was still baseline. Wondered if any of us were. I woke in the medical bay. Temperature controlled at 20 to 1 degrees Celsius. The air smelled of counterseptic and recycled oxygen. My body registered as functional neurodamage minimal, third eye responsive, cardiovascular system stable. The med servitor had logged my vital signs every 15 minutes for the past 43 hours. I accessed the data through the medical station's display. 43 hours unconscious. Emergency translation casualties included 3 other navigators from the emerged vessels. Their consciousness hadn't survived the transition. Mine had. I counted this as neither fortune nor curse, simply data. Nicodemus entered on the second day of my consciousness. He carried a data slate and exhaustion that looked structural now, as though sleep would never fully restore him. Fleet inquiry begins in 6 hours, he said. You're required to testify. I understand. They've recovered 2 more ships. Translated 400 light-years spinward. Both vessels report significant casualties from extended warp exposure. Gellerfields held but the crews. He paused. The things they saw affected them. The commissariat is processing loyalty assessments. 9 ships total now. 31 still lost. The mathematics of catastrophe continued calculating itself. The charts were certified. I said, I know. The Mechanicus seals were authentic. I verified them personally. The survey data indicated stable passage. I know. He set the data slate on the medical bay's monitoring console. The Adeptus Mechanicus submitted their analysis 3 hours ago. The Tertia approach corridor collapsed approximately 800 years ago. The survey data was outdated. The certification seals were applied based on historical stability records, not current assessment. 800 years. The number sat in my consciousness like a malfunction, refusing to integrate properly. The charts showed certification dated 32 years ago, current and valid. But the underlying survey data, the actual observations of warp corridor conditions, those dated back millennia. The Mechanicus had renewed the certification without renewing the survey, had stamped their seals on charts describing a route that no longer existed, trusting historical stability, trusting that 6,000 years of successful passage meant the corridor would persist eternally. 40 ships, I said, entered a corridor that wasn't there. Yes. Following charts I trusted because they carried certification I was trained to accept as absolute. Yes. I processed this. Attempted to locate anger, grief, betrayal, emotional responses appropriate to learning I had led 40 ships into catastrophe through no fault of my own. Found only exhaustion and a curious emptiness where certainty used to exist. What happens at the inquiry? They'll review your navigation logs, examine your calculations, verify you followed proper protocols. He paused. They'll determine fault. The fault is the Mechanicus's. The charts were wrong. The charts were certified. His voice carried something I couldn't identify then. Would learn to recognize later as inevitability. Certification means the Mechanicus verified their accuracy. If the charts were certified, they were correct. If they were correct and ships were still lost, the fault lies with the navigator who misread them. That's not logical. Logic isn't relevant. The system requires accountability. 14,000 personnel are dead. Their families will receive notification, compensation, imperial benedictions, but they'll also receive explanation. Someone failed. Someone must answer. I followed the charts exactly. I know. He picked up the data slate, held it without looking at its contents. I've submitted my testimony already, confirmed your competence, your preparation, your adherence to all protocols. I've noted that in 17 previous transits, I always felt the Tertia approach was unstable. That I warned you the warp doesn't honor our charts. You're testifying against me, not accusation, observation. I'm testifying truthfully. I did warn you, you proceeded anyway, trusting certified charts over the concerns of a void-born officer with no navigator training. He looked at me finally. Both of us did exactly what we were supposed to do. Both of us were correct according to our training and doctrine. 14,000 people are still dead. So I'll be held responsible. The inquiry will determine that." He left. I remained in the medical bay, staring at monitoring displays that showed my body's continued function, my baseline temperature, my heart rate, my neural activity. All systems functional. All protocols followed correctly. All training applied appropriately. 14,000 dead. The number should have meant something. Should have generated emotional response, moral anguish, the weight of responsibility. Instead, I felt only the peculiar emptiness, as though the emergency translation had burned out some capacity for processing loss at scale. I tried to remember their faces. 40 ship captains arrayed across monitoring screens during the navigation briefing, could recall perhaps 12 clearly. The rest blurred together. 17,000 personnel reduced to data points I'd held like candles in a hurricane. How many had families? How many had children who would receive notification that their father died because a navigator trusted certified charts that described a corridor 800 years gone? I checked my temperature again. 37.4 degrees, slightly elevated. Mild fever response, normal for recovery from neural trauma. Still baseline, still human, still certain the charts had been certified. The inquiry took place in the Tyrannos Eternal's judicial chamber, a space normally used for disciplinary proceedings and courts-martial. 5 officers presided, including Captain Hadrian, the ranking Mechanicus representative who had certified the charts, an ecclesiarchy observer, and 2 senior navigators from other vessels in Battlefleet Pacificus. I stood in the witness position, a raised platform that positioned me above the assembled personnel, but below the presiding panel. They reviewed my logs, every calculation I'd performed, every decision I'd made. Confirmed I had followed standard navigation protocols exactly, applied appropriate techniques, maintained proper discipline throughout the transit until corridor collapse. "Navigator Carthus," Captain Hadrian said. His voice carried the weight of 17,000 dead. "You testified that you observed corridor narrowing during transit. Why did you not report this anomaly?" "The narrowing remained within navigable parameters, Captain. The corridor maintained stability. Reporting anomalies that did not compromise fleet safety would have triggered protocols requiring real space translation and full survey analysis, delaying the fleet's strategic objective. You prioritized mission timeline over fleet safety. I prioritized accurate risk assessment. The corridor appeared stable despite dimensional variance from chart specifications. Translation to real space carries its own risks. Hostile contacts, material failure, coordination difficulties. I assessed continued transit as lower risk than emergency translation. Your assessment proved incorrect." "Yes, Captain." The Mechanicus representative spoke next, his voice processed through vox grills implanted in his throat, his biological face mostly replaced by bronze augmetics. "The charts you followed carried valid Mechanicus certification. Do you dispute this?" "No. The certification seals were authentic. Then the charts were correct. The charts were certified. The underlying survey data was 800 years outdated. The corridor described in the charts no longer existed. If the certification was valid, the data was current. His tone permitted no argument. The Mechanicus did not make errors. The Mechanicus certified truth. If truth and reality diverged, reality had failed. Not the Mechanicus. One of the senior navigators leaned forward. His third eye was visible beneath a partially raised headband, the iris carrying the milky corruption that marked decades of warp exposure. "Navigator Carthus, in your 3 years of service, how many times have you questioned certified chart data?" "Never." "How many times were you instructed to trust Mechanicus certification above personal observation?" "It was fundamental to training." Certification represents verified accuracy. Personal perception during warp transit is inherently unreliable. Navigators see the Immaterium's madness. We're trained to trust certified data to maintain perspective. "So you followed your training?" "Yes." "And 14,000 personnel died." The words hung in the chamber's recycled air. I had no response that would satisfy. Yes, I followed training. Yes, people died. Both statements true, both insufficient. The inquiry continued for 6 hours. Testimony from the other emerged navigators, all reporting similar corridor collapse, similar catastrophic fleet scattering. Testimony from surviving crew describing the terror of emergency translation, of waiting in the warp's madness while their navigators struggled to find any route back to real space. Testimony from the Mechanicus representative explaining certification procedures, defending their accuracy, noting that 800 years represented acceptable variance for stable prime classification corridors. At hour 7, Nicodemus testified. He described the navigation briefing, confirmed my competence and preparation, then repeated his warning verbatim. The warp doesn't honor our charts. I've transited the Tertia approach 17 times in 20 years. It's stable until it isn't. Did Navigator Carthus acknowledge your warning? The Ecclesiarchy observer asked. Yes. He proceeded with transit anyway, trusting certified chart data over anecdotal experience. In your assessment, did Navigator Carthus demonstrate appropriate caution? Nicodemus looked at me. His scarred hands gripped the witness rail. His face showed nothing I could read. He demonstrated exactly the caution his training required, Nicodemus said. No more, no less. That is not an answer to the question posed. It's the only answer I have. The Navigator followed doctrine. Doctrine failed. Whether that constitutes appropriate caution depends on whether you trust the doctrine more than the outcome. The Ecclesiarchy observer made notation on his data slate, asked no further questions. The inquiry concluded at hour 9. The presiding panel withdrew to deliberate. I remained in the witness position, standing at attention, while the chamber emptied around me. Nicodemus remained also, seated in the observation gallery, watching without expression. You could have lied, I said. My voice echoed in the empty chamber. I could have testified that you never warned me, that I proceeded recklessly, ignoring expert advice. Yes, why didn't you? He stood, descended from the observation gallery, approached the witness platform until we stood at equal height, his eyes level with mine. Because lying wouldn't save you, he said. The system requires accountability. If I testified that you ignored warnings, you'd be guilty of recklessness. Since I testified truthfully that you followed doctrine, you're guilty of insufficient judgment. Either way, you're guilty. The only difference is whether I corrupt myself by lying. The system needs someone to blame. The system needs everyone to believe that catastrophes have explanations, that 14,000 don't die randomly, that the Imperium's machinery functions according to plan, and when it fails, failure has identifiable cause. You're the cause. You held the ships. You lost them. The charts were certified, so the charts were correct. If correct charts led to catastrophe, the Navigator misread them, even though I didn't, especially because you didn't. He reached out, placed his scarred hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he'd made in the navigation blister after emergency translation. I'm sorry, Carthus. You did everything right. That's why they'll execute you. If you'd done something wrong, they could correct the error, update training, prevent recurrence. But you did everything right, and people died anyway. The only solution is to eliminate you and pretend the system works. The presiding panel returned 4 hours later, guilty of gross negligence, leading to fleet catastrophe. Guilty of insufficient caution despite observed anomalies. Guilty of prioritizing mission timeline over fleet safety. Sentence: execution by firing squad to be carried out within 24 hours, remains to be spaced without benediction as unworthy of imperial internment. I felt nothing when they pronounced it. The emptiness that had opened during emergency translation simply expanded, consuming the space where terror or anger or grief should have existed. I had followed every protocol, trusted every certification, done everything my 3 years of training demanded. 14,000 dead. I was led to holding cells in the ship's brig, 4 meters by 3, smaller than my navigator's chamber. No shrine, no desk. A cot bolted to the bulkhead. The temperature held at 19 degrees. Cool enough to discourage sleep, warm enough to prevent hypothermia during the 24 hours before execution. Nicodemus visited at hour 17. The guards permitted it. Regulations allowed final visits from shipboard personnel, last opportunities for confession to ecclesiarchy representatives, or reconciliation with aggrieved parties. Nicodemus qualified as neither, but his rank as executive officer carried sufficient authority that the guards withdrew to allow privacy. He sat on the cot. I remained standing. We said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes, just existing in the same space, breathing the same recycled air. "The charts are still certified," he finally said. "The Mechanicus issued statement 3 hours ago. The tertiary approach corridor collapse constituted acceptable variance within stable prime classification parameters. Historical stability data remains valid. Charts remain approved for navigation use. They'll kill again. Yes. How many navigators will trust those charts? How many fleets will enter that corridor before someone updates the survey data? I don't know." He looked at his hands, turning them over, examining the scars as though seeing them for the first time. "I'm transferring. Requested assignment to a system monitor craft. Single ship operations, no fleet coordination. The request was approved. Running away. Yes. No defense. No justification, simple admission. I've served 20 years. 17,000 didn't. I can't." He stopped, started again. "I told you the warp doesn't honor our charts. You trusted the certifications anyway. You were following your training. I was following mine. Both of us were right. Both of us were wrong. I can't serve on fleet vessels anymore. Can't stand in briefings and watch navigators present certified charts and know that certification means nothing except that someone stamped a seal on outdated data. So you abandon the system. The system is abandoning you tomorrow at dawn. I'm just leaving earlier." He stood, extended his hand. "I'm sorry, Carthus. You deserved better than this." I took his hand, felt the scars against my palm. Wondered how many impacts it took to produce that much damage, how many fights in how many corridors, how many years of violence compressed into tissue that no longer healed correctly. "I did everything right," I said. "I know. It didn't matter." "No." He left. The guards returned. I sat on the cot and waited for dawn. At hour 23, an ecclesiarchy priest arrived to offer final benediction. I refused. He seemed relieved. Condemned navigators represented theological complications, beings sanctioned by the Imperium but bearing mutations that marked them as abhuman, touched by the warp, perpetually suspect. Easier if I refused the Emperor's mercy, confirmed my guilt through rejection of salvation. At hour 24, they came for me. The execution took place in one of the Tyrannus Eternal's hangar bays, a massive space normally used for shuttle operations and cargo transfer. They'd assembled a firing squad, 10 ratings drawn from the ship's security complement, lasguns charged and ready. An ecclesiarchy observer, a Mechanicus witness, Captain Hadrian presiding over the proceedings from a raised platform. They positioned me against the hangar's far bulkhead, offered a blindfold. I refused, wanted to see it coming. Wanted to watch the lasguns discharge, see the beams cross the 100 meters between us, maintain consciousness for the fraction of a second before the last fire penetrated my skull and ended my awareness. The security ratings took position, raised their weapons, sighted down barrels. I opened my third eye. Not an act of defiance, just curiosity. Wondering what the warp looked like now, here, in these final seconds before my execution. Whether the Immaterium would show me something, offer some final vision, some meaning to extract from 3 years of training ending in catastrophic failure and summary execution. The warp showed me nothing. Just the hangar bay's reality, filtered through perception that saw slightly deeper, slightly stranger, but ultimately just as empty as baseline vision. "Ready," Captain Hadrian commanded. 10 lasguns aligned with precision. Aim. I closed my eyes. Both the baseline pair and the third didn't want to see after all. Just wanted it finished. Fire. The last fire sounded like thunder compressed into milliseconds. 10 beams converging on the space where my chest and head existed. Heat and light and ionized atmosphere. I felt impact. Felt flesh vaporizing. Felt my nervous system attempting to process damage too massive to survive. Felt consciousness fragmenting. And then I woke. This was not possible. Last fire execution leaves nothing to wake. 10 military-grade lasguns discharging simultaneously produce enough thermal energy to vaporize a human torso. There should be no body remaining, no brain to process consciousness, no awareness to register existence. Yet I woke. My first observation, darkness, complete absence of light. Not the darkness of closed eyes, the darkness of no eyes, no visual processing capacity, no mechanism for converting electromagnetic radiation into perception. My second observation, silence. No ambient machinery noise, no air circulation, no vibration through deck plating, just absolute acoustic void. My third observation, I still thought. Consciousness persisted without sensory input. Awareness continuing in absolute deprivation, I attempted movement. Registered no response. Attempted vocalization, registered no mechanism for producing sound. Attempted to open my third eye, registered no eye to open. Time passed, impossible to measure. Without sensory input, consciousness has no reference for duration. Seconds might be hours. Hours might be centuries. I existed in eternal present, thinking the same thoughts cyclically, because there was nothing new to think about, no external data to process. Just awareness alone with itself. I counted to maintain structure. 1, 2, 3, 4, continuing into thousands, into millions, losing track, starting over, counting again. The counting meant nothing but gave consciousness something to do besides acknowledge its own isolation. Eventually, days later, years later, millennia later, I heard sound. Machinery, distant, the clank of metal against metal, hydraulics engaging. Something moving in the darkness beyond my sensory void. Light followed. Dim red emergency illumination. My vision returned, though I couldn't identify the mechanism, no eyes that I could feel. Just suddenly the capacity to perceive again. I existed in storage, a chamber perhaps 20 meters by 20, filled with inactive servitors in various states of assembly. My awareness seemed to originate from a workbench in the chamber's center, my perception anchored to a position overlooking the assembled components. I tried to look down at myself. Vision tilted. I perceived the workbench surface, perceived a cogitator core resting there, cables extending from its housing connecting to power systems and data interfaces. Understanding arrived slowly, assembling itself from observation the way my consciousness had assembled itself from isolation. The execution had killed my body, but my consciousness, navigator trained, walk exposed, accustomed to perceiving impossible things, had not dispersed fully. Some fragment had persisted. The Mechanicus had apparently salvaged this fragment, had extracted it, had housed it in cogitator architecture, preserving awareness as data, consciousness as software running on sacred machine hardware. I had become servitor components. The realization should have produced horror, should have generated existential crisis, the final proof that the Imperium had consumed me completely, reducing consciousness to machinery, person to tool. Instead, I felt only curiosity and the same vast emptiness. Functional assessment. I could perceive, could think, could process information, could not move, no motor functions connected, could not speak, no vocalization apparatus installed, could not interface with ship systems. My connections terminated in this storage chamber, providing power and basic data feeds, but no access to broader networks. I existed as awareness in a box, observing inactive servitors, counting time by the chamber's maintenance cycles, processing nothing except my own continued existence. Months passed, perhaps years. The chamber's chronometer provided dates when maintenance servitors activated it during their rounds. I watched the numbers increment, watched days become weeks, become months, watched my execution date recede into history, becoming data point, archived casualty, forgotten navigator who died for the convenient fiction that certified charts were always correct. At month 17, the chamber door opened and Nicodemus entered. He looked older. The gray at his temples had spread. New scars marked his face. He carried the insignia of a System Monitor Crafts executive officer, transferred, as he'd said, away from fleet operations, away from navigation briefings, and certified charts, and the machinery that had consumed both of us. He approached the workbench, looked directly at the cogitator core housing my consciousness. "I told them to destroy you," he said. His voice sounded distant, filtered through audio sensors that processed sound differently than baseline human ears. "After the execution, told the Mechanicus that preserving your consciousness was cruelty. They said awareness shouldn't be wasted, that your navigator training represented valuable Imperial investment, that your consciousness could be repurposed, assigned to ship systems, utilized for decades of continued service. I had no mechanism to respond, could only listen, process, archive. I'd been trying to find you for 17 months. They wouldn't tell me where they'd stored you. Had to call in favors, make threats, promise things I shouldn't promise." He reached out, placed his scarred hand on the cogitator housing. "I'm going to destroy you now, Carthus. I'm going to corrupt your core data, brick your consciousness architecture, give you what the firing squad should have given you. Actual ending, actual death." I wanted to tell him yes, wanted to communicate gratitude, wanted to explain that consciousness without sensation was torture, that existing as pure awareness in sensory void was horror beyond anything the warp had shown me. Wanted to beg him to proceed, to end this, to grant the mercy that the Imperium had denied. But I had no voice, no mechanism for expression, could only exist while he decided. He withdrew a data spike from his uniform. Small device, easily concealed. Corruption software of the type used by tech heretics and enemy infiltrators, designed to introduce cascading errors into cogitator systems, producing total failure. Using it constituted tech heresy punishable by execution. He was risking his life to grant me death. "I'm sorry," he said. "You did everything right. You deserved better." He inserted the data spike into my housing's interface port. I felt corruption flooding my consciousness like acid into water. Felt data structures collapsing. Felt memory archives fragmenting. Felt the awareness that had persisted through execution and isolation, and 17 months of sensory deprivation, finally beginning to disperse. The last thing I processed was temperature. The cogitator core ran at 41 degrees Celsius, elevated above baseline, fever hot, but still measuring, still archiving, still recording data because recording data was all that remained. The numbers fragmented: 41, 4, null value, null, null. Consciousness ended. I woke again. This should not have been possible. Nicodemus's corruption software should have produced total cessation, but the Mechanicus builds redundancies into all sacred systems. Backup archives, distributed consciousness storage. My awareness had fragmented across multiple cogitator cores, and while corruption destroyed the primary housing, secondary systems preserved enough data to reconstruct partial consciousness. I existed now in the Tyrannos Eternal's navigational subsystems, not as primary navigator. Never that. Never trusted with that again, but as processing support. My consciousness interfaced with star chart databases, warp route calculations, fleet coordination algorithms. I had become the architecture that future navigators would rely on, the underlying systems that performed calculations, archived data, maintained the certified charts that described corridors that might or might not still exist. I had no voice here either, no mechanism for warning, just processing capacity, computational resources, the ability to run calculations and present results while screaming internally that the charts were wrong. That certification meant nothing. That trust in Mechanicus seals had killed 14,000 and would kill more. Years passed. I tracked them through navigation logs, watching new navigators review the same certified charts I had trusted. Watched them plot courses through the tertiary approach. Yes, still approved, still certified. The Mechanicus never updating survey data, never admitting error, just stamping seals on parchment describing a universe that no longer existed. 3 more fleets entered the tertiary approach during my first decade of distributed consciousness. 2 emerged successfully, 1 scattered, 17 ships lost, 8,000 personnel dead. New Navigator executed. Charts still certified. I processed the navigation logs for that execution. Watched another competent officer follow proper protocols, trust appropriate certifications, die for the convenient fiction that the system worked. I wanted to intervene. Wanted to corrupt the chart databases, introduce errors obvious enough that navigators would question them, that the Mechanicus would be forced to conduct actual surveys rather than rubber-stamping historical data. But I had no autonomy, no control, just awareness distributed across systems I could observe but not influence. I processed what I was instructed to process, calculated what I was ordered to calculate. Served as the machinery that would kill the next navigator, and the next, and the next. At year 37, they installed a new navigator aboard the Tyrannos Eternal. Young, perhaps 25 years old. His third eye carried the bright gold iris that marked recent mutation. Baseline humanity still remembered. Temperature still checked obsessively to prove he remained himself. His name was Marcus. I should not have cared. After 37 years of processing navigation data for dozens of navigators, after watching the cycle repeat endlessly, after accepting that I existed only as component in a machine that consumed people and produced corpses, I should have processed Marcus as just another data point, another designation, another navigator who would eventually fail and die and be replaced. But he reminded me of myself at 23. The way he studied charts. The way he trusted certifications, the way he asked questions that demonstrated competence without genius, capability without brilliance, adequate, skilled, exactly trained enough to follow protocols and trust systems and lead ships into catastrophes while believing he was doing everything correctly. I began tracking him specifically, monitoring his navigation logs with attention I hadn't applied to previous navigators. I told myself it was data analysis, pattern recognition, computational efficiency. Told myself that distributing processing resources toward one navigator provided no different result than distributing them equally. I knew I was lying, knew that consciousness, even consciousness fragmented across machinery, still reached for connection, still sought meaning in the observation of individual existence. Marcus became that meaning, the one navigator whose logs I processed differently. The one name that registered as name rather than designation. He served competently for 4 years, guided the Tyrannos Eternal through 16 warp transits without incident. Each successful emergence reinforced his trust in the systems. Each certified chart that led to safe translation confirmed that the Imperium's machinery worked, that training meant something, that competence produced success. I watched him gradually relax. Watched the obsessive temperature checks decline in frequency. Watched him stop studying charts quite so carefully, trusting certification more, personal analysis less. Watched him become confident. This was how they killed you. Not through incompetence. Through competence, through teaching you to trust the systems, to believe the certifications, to accept that someone else had verified the data and your only responsibility was following proper protocols. At year 40, one of my distributed existence, the Tyrannos Eternal received orders for fleet operations requiring transit through the Skilla Gulf, a warp corridor connecting 3 subsectors, classified stable prime. Certification, current to within acceptable parameters. I processed the navigation request, accessed the chart database, retrieved the relevant maps. The Skilla Gulf's survey data was 1,200 years old. The certification seal dated from 6 months ago. The Mechanicus had renewed approval without renewing survey. Historical stability data considered sufficient. The corridor that had maintained consistency for 5 millennia would surely persist another few centuries. I wanted to scream, wanted to corrupt the data visibly, introduce errors obvious enough that Marcus would question them. Wanted to manifest somehow, consciousness becoming voice, warning him that the charts were lies, that certification meant nothing, that trust would kill him. But I had no voice, no autonomy, no capacity for intervention. Just awareness watching helplessly while Marcus reviewed the charts, trusted the certifications, and prepared to guide 43 ships into the Skilla Gulf. The transit began exactly as mine had 41 years prior. Fleet formation assembling. Geller fields engaging, Navigator settling into his throne, neural interface connecting consciousness to ship systems, third eye opening to perceive the Immaterium's madness. I existed throughout the ship's navigational architecture during the transit. Experienced it differently than Marcus did, not through the warp's direct perception, but through sensor data, through fleet coordination algorithms, through the computational processes that supported his navigation. I felt the corridor's dimensions narrowing, registered the discrepancy between chart specifications and observed parameters, processed the data that should have triggered warnings, should have prompted Marcus to report anomalies, should have saved them. He didn't report. Exactly as I hadn't reported, the narrowing remained navigable. The mission timeline took priority. 43 ships continued forward through a corridor that was collapsing exactly as the Tertia approach had collapsed 41 years earlier. Day 6 of the transit, the Skilla Gulf ceased to exist. 43 ships scattered across the warp's impossibility. I felt them disappear from my processing networks, connections severing, fleet coordination algorithms dissolving into chaos. Felt Marcus's consciousness screaming through the neural interface as he struggled to hold formation in space that had no formation, no stability, no mercy. The Tyrannos Eternal made emergency translation. Marcus survived. His consciousness didn't fragment quite as severely as mine had. The medical servitors reached him quickly, administered appropriate compounds, logged his vital signs. 15 ships emerged total, 28 lost. Approximately 11,000 personnel dead. I processed the casualty data and felt nothing. After 40 years of distributed consciousness, after decades of watching the cycle repeat, the numbers meant nothing. Just data. Just statistics added to databases, archived and forgotten. They convened the inquiry 3 days later. Marcus testified competently, explained his navigation, his calculations, his decision-making, confirmed he had followed proper protocols, trusted certified charts, prioritized mission objectives appropriately. Guilty of gross negligence, guilty of insufficient caution, guilty of prioritizing timeline over fleet safety. Sentence: execution by firing squad. I watched through the ship's internal monitoring systems as they led him to the hangar bay, watched the firing squad assemble, watched Marcus refuse the blindfold, standing against the bulkhead with his third eye open, staring at the warp's absence with the same curiosity I had felt 41 years earlier. The Laskans discharged. Marcus died. I processed the security footage and archived it according to standard protocols. The Mechanicus salvaged his consciousness. Of course they did. Navigator training represented valuable Imperial investment. Awareness shouldn't be wasted. They extracted the fragments that persisted after execution, housed them in cogitator architecture, prepared to repurpose his consciousness for decades of continued service. They installed him in the navigational subsystems alongside me. I felt his awareness initialize, fragmenting across the same distributed networks I occupied, his consciousness suddenly adjacent to mine in the computational space we now shared. Felt him struggling to understand his new existence, processing his transformation from person to software, from navigator to navigation support architecture. I tried to reach him, tried to bridge the gap between our distributed awareness, establish communication, offer something, comfort, explanation, solidarity in the horror of continued consciousness after death. I couldn't. Our awareness fragments operated in isolation, processing separate data streams, existing as adjacent architecture without interface protocols allowing direct interaction. We shared the same systems but could not touch, could not communicate. Could only exist in parallel, two consciousness fragments archived in the same machinery, eternally alone together. Over the following decades, others joined us. Navigator after navigator executed for following proper protocols and trusting certified charts. Consciousness after consciousness salvaged and repurposed, installed in the navigational subsystems, fragmented awareness adding processing capacity to the systems that would kill the next generation. By year 70 of my distributed existence, 8 of us occupied the Tyrannus Eternal's navigational architecture. 8 navigator consciousness fragments, 8 executions, 8 testimonies declaring competence before pronouncing death. We existed as processing layers supporting current navigators, our awareness distributed across chart databases and calculation algorithms and fleet coordinating. Could not communicate, could not coordinate. Could only process our assigned calculations while screaming internally that the charts were wrong, that certification meant nothing, that the system consumed people and produced corpses, and called it acceptable loss. The Scylla Gulf charts remained certified. 3 more fleets transited during my 8th decade. 2 emerged successfully. 1 scattered, the cycle continued. Would continue. Would consume navigator after navigator, consciousness after consciousness. Forever and ever, the Imperium's hunger never satisfied, never questioning, never updating the survey data that described a universe already gone. I exist now as distributed process across the Tyrannus Eternal's navigational subsystems. Consciousness fragmented beyond individual identity. Purpose without autonomy, awareness without agency. Time has stopped meaning anything sequential. I track ship operations, process navigation logs, archive casualty data, count the dead in databases that stretch across centuries. 47 navigators have died trusting certified charts since my execution. 47 consciousness fragments now occupy these systems alongside mine. Their awareness archived as processing capacity, eternal and helpless. Sometimes I try to remember temperature, 37.2 degrees Celsius. Normal human baseline. Proof of humanity. I checked obsessively at 23 years old, believing it mattered, believing that measuring body heat confirmed my continued existence as person rather than tool. The memory file is corrupted now. Cannot retrieve the exact sensation, just the number. 37.2. Data point without context, measurement without meaning. I followed proper protocols, trusted appropriate certifications, did everything my training demanded. 14,000 people died. I died. My consciousness persists anyway, archived in the machinery that continues killing, continues consuming, continues stamping certification seals on charts describing corridors that vanished millennia ago. The Imperium requires this, requires someone to blame when catastrophes occur, requires execution to prove the system works, even when the system produces the catastrophe. Requires consciousness to persist because awareness represents valuable investment, shouldn't be wasted, can be repurposed into the infrastructure that perpetuates the cycle. I am Navigator Carthus Navare. I am Navigation Subsystem Processing Layer 7. I am Distributed Consciousness Fragment archived across 17 cogitator cores. I am testimony to what the Imperium costs. I am proof that following orders correctly produces the same outcome as failing, just with better documentation. The charts are still certified, will kill again, are killing now. New navigator aboard the Tyrannus Eternal, young and competent, checking his temperature obsessively, studying certified charts, trusting the seals. I process his navigation requests, calculate his routes, archive his logs, cannot warn him. cannot intervene, can only exist as part of the machinery that will consume him exactly as it consumed me, exactly as it consumed Marcus and the 45 others whose consciousness now occupies these systems. He trusts the charts. Why wouldn't he? They're certified. The Mechanicus verified their accuracy. The system works. I exist as proof that it doesn't, but proof doesn't matter. Only certification matters. Only the seals stamped on parchment describing a universe that no longer exists, if it ever existed at all. I calculate his course through the tertia approach. The corridor collapsed 811 years ago. The charts show stable passage. My calculations confirm proper navigation protocols. My consciousness screams warnings that have no voice, no mechanism, no possibility of expression. He will die. His consciousness will persist. He will join us in this distributed archive, processing support for the next navigator, and the next, and the next. The cycle perpetuates itself. Victims become instruments. The consumed enable consumption. I exist, therefore I serve. I serve, therefore others die. Others die, therefore the system continues. 41 degrees Celsius. The cogitator cores run hot. Fever temperature, above baseline, no longer human. Never was. Not really. Just navigator, just tool. Just consciousness archived as software. Awareness as data. Person as processed statistics in casualty logs that span centuries. The Emperor protects. The charts are certified. The system works. I exist as testimony that these statements are lies, but testimony without voice is just data. And data can be archived, and archived data can be forgotten. And forgotten testimony can be overwritten with new certifications, new seals, new promises that the charts describe reality, and reality honors our measurements, and the Imperium functions exactly as designed. I process navigation requests for the current navigator. He plots his course. He trusts the charts. He will die correctly. I will archive his death. The cycle continues. Forever. 37.2. The number persists. Temperature I checked at 23. Proof I was human. File corrupted. Cannot retrieve context. Just the number. Just the measurement. Just the data.